A few weeks ago, I was watching an old replay of a past World Cup final, the 2010 final, between Spain and the Netherlands. This had been the first major tournament that I'd ever paid attention to. Because of that, this rewatch brought back a ton of memories. Memories of the vuvuzelas, the impossible movements of the Jabulani. But if we're talking about the football itself, the Spanish team, which thanks to a late Andres Iniesta goal went on to win that final, cuts a pretty small figure in my mind. It's strange because Spain in 2010 weren't an unworthy winner. This was a side in the midst of one of the most dominant runs that any national team has ever gone on. But in South Africa, well, they were pretty boring to watch. Of course, not everyone agreed. Many adored the absurd technique of the Spanish midfielders who could needle their way through the tightest of spaces. But take a look at some of the discourse around that 2010 World Cup, and the overwhelming opinion was quite simply that watching Spain tiki-taka the ball between each other for an entire match, with their opponents way too petrified to try dispossessing them and risk compromising their defensive structure, was a tough watch. So how did one of the greatest international teams that football has ever seen come to be considered perhaps its most uninspiring World Cup winner? Let's rewind a few years to the Euros of 2008, the tournament in which Spain broke through its thickest glass ceiling, winning its first major trophy since 1964. These guys were anything but boring. I mean, sure, they dominated possession, playing the same tiki-taka football as 2010, but it was possession with a little more space and freedom than what would later be afforded to them. In 2008, this close quarters style of football was novel. It took teams by surprise. Simply put, the opposition didn't know how to deal with the likes of Xavi and Iniesta, who, because of being afforded the extra half spaces thanks to opposition not yet being wise to the danger their intricate passing presented, constantly were finding wide open passing lanes to punch through balls into the likes of David Villa out wide on the flank or Fernando Torres up forward. But this free-flowing but still technically minded small-sided football had an expiration date. And that's because other countries were quickly cottoning onto the fact that in their attempts to press the Spaniards high to go toe-to-toe with them, well, they were only hurting themselves. They certainly weren't hurting Spain. The thing that people forget about this Spanish side is that whilst their 2008 victory revealed on the grandest of stages the type of football that they were capable of playing, this constituted just 6 games, just 6 matches of football from which their opposition could try and figure out how to counter the threat that they posed. 9 to 10 hours of football isn't much to take from in the grand scheme of things, but how does 200 hours sound? 200 hours is roughly the amount of football that Barcelona played across all competitions between Euro 2008 and South Africa 2010. It's relevant because much of Spain's starting 11, including some of their most important players, Xavi, Iniesta, but also now Sergio Busquets, Carles Puyol and Gerard Piqué, all played that same tiki-taka style of football for the Catalan club for pretty much that entire 200-hour period. They'd won a Champions League in the process, 2 La Liga titles too. If you were following football back then, you'd know already that they were the most talked about, the most studied club in all of Europe. So when the Spanish national team rolled into South Africa, there was no real secret to the way that they would play. It was obvious that Spain would totally control the ball, totally control the match, and that pressing forward with even the slightest bit of aggression would have you leaking goals like a sieve. And so how do you think other countries prepared to face Spain in South Africa? Well, they elected to completely park the bus. But this wasn't simply a bus park. This was a complete concession by the competition to Spain that we know that we're not going to take the ball away from you consistently. So rather than trying to deny you time on the ball, we're going to deny you space. We'll let you have the ball for as long as you like, but we cannot afford to let our defensive lines stretch more than a few meters apart. Switzerland put this theory into action in the opening game of World Cup 2010. Spain monopolised possession, but every avenue into the penalty area had been sealed shut. Switzerland gave Spain complete control of the ball in exchange for complete control of the space. And it worked. Spain recorded 24 shots on goal, but most came in frustration from outside the box. And the Swiss rolled away with a famous 1-0 victory. One of the biggest upsets in World Cup history. Meanwhile, all the way across in Group D, a very different opening match was taking place for the Germans against the Australians. And that's because Germany had piled on 4 goals by the 70th minute, a dominant performance, and that's putting it lightly. I fell in love with the Germans during this tournament. The way they played their football, it was just so explosive, so vertical, so fast, and so clinical. In the knockouts, they proved that their domination of the Socceroos was no fluke. 4 more goals against England in the round of 16 and then 4 goals again against Argentina in a quarter-final. This came in stark contrast to the Spanish path toward their own knockouts, who won their remaining group stage matches playing in much the same way as that opening loss, with absurd amounts of possession against some very defensive opponents. I wasn't the only one to notice the difference, of course. Whilst football purists, those who value touch and technique on the ball, remains loyal to Spain, despite the almost chess-like patience in which their games often played out, Germany were the talk of the town, wanting, or rather demanding, swift transitions of the ball up forward into the feet of a young Mesut Ozil, who could either play the likes of Miroslav Klose, Lukas Podolski, or a young Thomas Muller in with some beautiful weighted through balls, or take a pot shot from outside the box himself. The Spaniards were further hampered by the fact that Fernando Torres, the man so crucial in stretching the European defences of 2008, arrived in South Africa dogged by injury and in no condition to serve as the focal point for the Spanish attack. And so Spain desperately required an alternative to provide that focal point, and they received it in the form of David Villa. It's an interesting distinction because whilst Germany's goals came in waves with Ozil, Müller, Klose and Podolski carving teams apart in devastating transitions, Spain increasingly relied on Villa to provide the finishing touches to a midfield content enough to sit on the ball and wait for opportunities to present. Villa was quiet in the opening match, which probably proved the difference in the end, but he burst into life against Honduras on match day 2, scoring one of the goals of the tournament amidst a double before striking again against Chile to qualify his country to a round of 16 match against Iberian neighbours Portugal. Now, Portugal hadn't conceded a goal heading into this knockout tie, which is an especially impressive feat considering that they just played the tournament's group of death, featuring the likes of Brazil, but also Cote d'Ivoire, who were the most talented team in Africa at the time. This was a side who, operating under the management of Carlos Queiroz, were quite obviously going to try and keep the game as closed off as possible. But Spain still managed to break them down in normal time, with David Villa providing the finishing touch to a beautiful through ball which caught the impervious Portuguese defence napping for the first time in about 5.5 hours. Now, admittedly, the goal was offside. It wouldn't have stood the test of VAR, but it was also the product of mounting Spanish pressure throughout the game. David Villa's movement had ultimately put luck on his side, and the Spaniards, despite playing a match immediately talked down for being too defensive given the quality of players on the pitch, had been the ones repeatedly trying to make the play. But if the Spaniards thought that Queiroz ball was going to prove their toughest adversary, well, they were going to be proven completely wrong, because up next in the quarterfinal, they were scheduled to face Paraguay. The match was a controversial one. The Paraguayans had a goal ruled out for what looked an incorrect offside call in the 41st minute, then had a penalty saved by Iker Casillas in the 60th. In the end, David Villa proved the difference maker in the closing minutes, cementing his side a second 1-0 victory. But despite now having qualified for a World Cup semi-final, there remained a lingering sense that this Spanish side hadn't truly convinced. 5 matches into the tournament, they'd scored just 5 goals and scraped through successive knockout fixtures in controversial circumstances. They were also now due to face the all-conquering Germans in that semi-final, who by now were just about the favourites to lift the World Cup. But when the two finally met in Durban, Spain delivered arguably their finest performance of the tournament. Rather than being overwhelmed by Germany's explosive counterattacks, they simply denied them the opportunity to play. Xavi, Iniesta and Busquets monopolised possession, dictated the tempo and pinned Germany back for almost an entire evening. Eventually, Spain's control of the match was rewarded from a towering Carlos Puyol header, sealing a deserved 1-0 victory and sending the country through to their first ever World Cup final. In the end, of course, Spain beat the Netherlands in what would go down as one of the ugliest World Cup finals ever played, with the Dutch abandoning any real attempts at football in favour of disrupting Spain's rhythm at every opportunity. And that was something of a microcosm of Spain's tournament as a whole. They were utterly dominant on the ball, controlled matches with remarkable ease, but lacked the firepower to turn that control into comfortable victories. It meant that instead of overwhelming opponents like, say, France is doing right now, they simply gave them so little of the game that one goal was often all it took to carry them to the trophy.